Welcome to my garden. I'm Chameleon Jackson. I'm a green hedge and sometimes kitchen witch. Today I'm going to start a series about witch hunts through history. It's easy to think the witch hunt started and ended in Salem, Massachusetts, but this is far from the truth. And I'm going to argue the witch hunts are alive and happening all around us today. I'm going to start with the modern day, examining what a witch hunt looks like now and its different names. But to start, let's look at the precursor of modern witch trials, the Satanic Panic. The Satanic Panic is normally defined as a widespread moral panic, rising from allegations of satanic ritual abuse in the USA, starting in the 1980s and spreading to the rest of the world, peaking in the 1990s and still existing, and arguably again on the rise in 2025. Most younger people will recognise the Satanic Panic from media set in the period of the 1980s and early 90s, with Stranger Things recently using it as a plot in Season 4 with the school's Hellfire Club, which is nothing more than a gaming club who play Dungeons and Dragons and possibly tabletop war games, although they would have likely been playing Napoleonic war games, since fantasy and sci-fi war games weren't really in the public consciousness at that period of time. So I don't know what the issue is with that particular club. This form of satanic panic is widely seen as the crux of what happened. The truth is so much worse, and like moral panics that came before, think Salem, Massachusetts or Pennington, UK, Satanic Panic of the 1980s and 1990s was nothing more than a witch hunt conducted by unscrupulous people in a position to gain power or money at the expense of those who either wouldn't or more likely couldn't protect themselves against the fervent fanaticism that comes from following fundamentalist frauds. Although it might have been nice to just jump straight into all the fun things that the Satanic Panic tried to ban, we unfortunately have to start with a frankly more disturbing history. Although there was never actually any children involved, or any abuse of any kind happened, it resulted in the ruination of numerous innocent lives, as well as psychological damage to those same children who couldn't possibly understand what they were being asked, and never asked to be involved in the nightmare that would follow. First, for a little bit of history. Although the Satanic Panic of the modern day manifested in the 1980s, its origins are a little bit earlier. The 1960s onwards saw the rise of new religious movements, that is, spiritual groups that have modern origins, whether through new ways of thinking or the combination of previously existing spiritual practices, and eventually saw the rise of the Manson family. This whole thing came to a head on the dates between August 9th and 10th in 1969, when Charles Manson and his followers committed 5 acts of murder in a conspiracy to initiate a prophesied race war known as the Helter Skelter, but I'll cover that in another video. The late 1960s also saw the introduction of a new kind of media, the big budget horror movie. Suddenly Lon Chaney's Thousand Faces weren't the only thing haunting your nightmares, and Peter Cushing's Van Helsing wouldn't be hunting down Christopher Lee's Dracula, because a new type of horror was tormenting you through the flickering celluloid. Demonic horror. Demonic horror shown on the screen with Rosemary's Baby, the story of a woman pregnant with the Antichrist, which hit in 1968. The head-turning terror of The Exorcist followed in 1973, telling the story of a teenage girl possessed by Pazuzu, the Mesopotamian god of the east wind. And then in late 1976, the release of The Omen, which definitely acted as a solid reminder not to trust people named Damien, especially if they own a Doberman, hit the cinemas. Although I joke about these movies, it is impossible to state just how effective they were on the audiences of the day, and enduring impact of the stories that they had told. I've personally heard people say that she was like The Exorcist as a turn of phrase to describe somebody acting out of character. On a side note to this, the Exorcists in the film are the good guys, and it's Reagan who's possessed and spider walking all over the place. And the famous head turning scene is so famous that it seems to be known whether you've actually seen the film or not. So why does that matter? These films began seeding the idea that it wasn't just the Wolfman or the Gillman who would drag us into the darkness, and we certainly weren't in danger of giant nuclear ants, but now interfering with the occult could immediately and irrevocably seal our doom, not in our towns, nor in our homes, not even in our bodies, but in our very soul. "1972 saw the release of The Satan Cellar by Mike Warnke. The book details Warnke's life as a poor orphan child, being brought up into a satanic cult with everything that entailed: substance abuse, magic, summoning and communing with demons, blood sacrifice and rituals involving animals and eventually children, as well as essay of those sacrifices. You know, all the things pagans apparently do. The stories of Warnke led him to become a major star in the evangelical world, and he even claims to have had names of powerhouses in the Satanic world, like the aforementioned Charles Manson attached to him. The insight of a man who had actually been involved in ritual magic and had been saved by Jesus Christ himself gave the church a huge amount of ammunition against pagans and non-believers of every stripe, because now an expert had stepped into the fray, a man who knew what they were up to and was redeemed by the Christian church. Potentially, this was a man who could turn the tide against evil in a world and would be the key player in what was to come. Following the release of The Satan Cellar, 1980 saw the release of Michelle Remembers, a book detailing the counselling sessions between a woman named Michelle Smith and her psychologist Dr. Lawrence Pazda. The book covers a shocking discovery that through hypnosis, Michelle brought repressed childhood memories of being raised in a satanic cult to the forefront. This allowed Pazda to document ways in which practitioners of Satanism practice. Michelle Remembers was a massive hit and became a bestseller, feeding further into the belief that we were all at risk of losing our innocence, but also that satanic cults were actively recruiting children. This book, in combination with The Satan Cellar, created an uproar of moral indignation, leading to a horrendous accusation being levied at certain individuals, without evidence, and creating one of the most unstable periods in US judicial setting in the modern day. For now, we'll leave Warnocky and Michelle for a later video, because their story doesn't end here, and they do deserve videos of their own. Just remember that they came in from nowhere with books which catapulted Satanism into the public consciousness and confirmed it wasn't just real, it was everywhere. Let's get started with the most well-known one, Dungeons & Dragons. For everyone that doesn't know, Dungeons & Dragons is a tabletop role-playing game, or TTRPG, designed by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. TTRPG is a game where a number of players, often called heroes, take on challenges and participate in stories led by a game master, a GM, or a dungeon master known as a DM. They're very much the same thing, different terminology. The players create a character that will inhabit for the duration of the campaign and will play that character by making decisions for what they'll do in a given situation. The game actually rewards playing your character well and is flexible enough that almost anything you can imagine can be implemented. It's possible to play D&D with just pen and paper, however. It is based off miniature war games, and including them really enhances the game, allowing for more in-depth detail to be added, such as fully explorable dungeons and towns, and allowing for a better visualization of what's happening in the game, as you have a physical representation of what's happening in any situation. Dungeons & Dragons is a fantasy game with heavy influences taken from J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth series, although you won't have to look far to find other more horror-aligned influences, especially the works of H.P. Lovecraft and his Cthulhu mythos, Rob D. Howard's Conan stories, and the Dying Earth cycles of Jack Vance, as well as ancient history and myths. And with all of these things, you can see where this is going. Through history, the Christian Church has been at odds with pagan beliefs, going as far as to co-opt some of the festivals in order to help acclimate new converts to the religion. This doesn't mean they agreed with them, but it was easy to get people to follow your way of thinking if you gave them something back. And over time, those festivals became integrated into the Christian religion, just on how hardcore Christians are. Players create a character that they will inhabit for the duration of the campaign, and roleplay that character by making decisions for what they'll actually do in a given situation. The game actually rewards playing your character well and is flexible enough for almost anything you can imagine to be implemented. It's possible to play D&D with just pen and paper, however it is based off a miniature war game, and including them really enhances the game, allowing for more in-depth detail to be added, such as fully explorable dungeons and towns, and allows for a better visualization of what's happening in game, as you have a physical representation of the situation. Although role-playing games with different settings exist now, Dungeons & Dragons is a fantasy game with heavy influences taken from J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth series, although you wouldn't have to look too far to find more horror-aligned influences, especially the works of H.P. Lovecraft and his Cthulhu mythos, Rob D. Howard's Conan stories, and the Dying Earth cycle of Jack Vance, as well as ancient history and myths, and with all of these things going into a pot together, I'm sure you can see where this is going. Through history, the Christian Church has been at odds with pagan beliefs, going as far as to co-opt some of the festival in order to help acclimate new converts to the religion. It doesn't mean they agreed with what they were doing, but it was easy to get people to follow your way of thinking if you gave them a little bit something back. And over time, those festivals became integrated into the Christian religion. Just don't tell a hardcore Christian that they're actually worshipping a pagan idol when they're celebrating their festivals. They'll definitely have a terrible comeback about lakes of fire and their intention to pray for you. If you've got something better as a comeback, write it in the comments below. But in seriousness, if you do write a comment regarding this below, keep it, respectable. The Dungeons and Dragons controversy, like the Satanic Panic proper, has its origins just prior to the 1980s. In 1979, in fact, with the disappearance of James Das Egbert III, who was something of a child prodigy and was attending Michigan State University to study computer science at the age of 16. Make no mistakes about this was a smart kid who was on the bleeding edge of technology. But on the 15th of August 1979, Egbert left his dormitory, leaving a suicide note, and entered the university's steam tunnels, where he consumed a large amount of methaqualone, a hypnotic sedative, in an unsuccessful attempt on his own life. An investigation started, and reports during the investigation stated that he attended Gen Con 12, which is a TTRPG con. The private investigator in charge of finding Egbert was a William Deere, who was a friend of Egbert's uncle, and was hired on the 20th of August when James was eventually reported missing to his mother by the university. Their initial conversation raised the idea that Egbert might have ideation on ending his own life. The story was picked up and reported on in the university's newspaper, and further interviews in the state news asserted that an anonymous friend had reported that Egbert was known to leave the campus alone to unknown locations. This story created great interest in the disappearance. As previously stated, it was incorrectly reported that Egbert had been seen at a convention on the day of his disappearance, and once Deere knew that he was a fan of D&D, he began to publicly proclaim that the police theories that the game was involved were likely correct, and linked to a running campaign. I should probably clarify another way of playing role-playing games at this point, because whilst it's popular in its own right, it's a bit too niche to include in the whole D&D description. That style of playing is called live-action role-playing, or LARPing, L-A-R-P-G. Like the name suggests, a LARPer acts out the game in real life using costumes and soft foam weapons, and is a lot more physical than you might imagine. I personally don't see the draw in it, because you're never going to be able to pull off the amazing acrobatic feats of the tabletop game, but it makes the players happy. It's a social experience and it's a great deal of exercise for them. So more power to them, and long live LARPers. But getting back to it, Deere found that Egbert was an active LARPer, and he and his friends would play down in the steam tunnels. So he came to the conclusion that Robert had entered the tunnels and hurt himself, or become lost in the tunnels. However, this theory only added to the sensationalism with journalism, claiming that D&D is a secret cult that players can only join by invitation. And whilst that is technically true, because you can only join a game by invitation, it would just be rude to sit down and demand to let the players let you join in. There are no cult aspects outside of the potential for a cult to exist as part of the narrative. It's just a group of people sitting at the table, being social and using their imagination. The search for Egbert continued for weeks before Deere received a telephone call from Morgan City, Louisiana. The caller? James Das Egbert III. Egbert had been hiding out at a friend's house before boarding a bus for New Orleans. Whilst he was there, he had made another attempt on his life using a cyanide, and when that failed, he'd moved on to Louisiana, where he found work as a labourer. Deere rushed to collect Egbert and returned him to his uncle, although they didn't share details of Egbert's time away. A year later, Rona Jaffe published a book based on the disappearance called Mazes and Monsters, which was later adapted into a 1982 film of the same name starring Tom Hanks. The story is told as a cautionary tale against role-playing games. However, it's clear that the main character is written as though they suffer from some form of very severe psychosis. It feels a lot like they've written as a schizophrenic going through a psychotic episode, and it leans heavily into the idea that the game causes delusions that manifest with mental disorders and take on a more sinister role. Unfortunately, this might be by the author's bias or the worldview at the time. The character is written as he's simply mad, which is with no care taken to understand the struggles of people who live with these problems. Unfortunately, Egbert's story doesn't have a happy ending. A year following his disappearance, Egbert was found with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He was taken to Grandview Hospital, where 5 days after admission, he sadly passed away at the age of 17. Egbert's organs were reportedly used for transplantation, where the hospital used the computer network to find the recipient, which I think is a fitting end considering his expertise with computers. Egbert passed on the 16th of August 1980. The events surrounding James's disappearance weren't made public until 1984, when Deere released the book The Dungeon Master, The Disappearance of James Das Egbert III, where Deere stated that the assertion that D&D was the cause of James's disappearance was over-sensationalised tabloid reporting. The disappearance of James and the release of Mazes and Monsters, both the book and the movie, increased public discomfort around role-playing games, and we'll take a look at that in a moment, but first I want to talk about Egbert and my perspective on what happened here. Egbert was very young at the time of his disappearance. He was only 16 after all, and although he was studying at university level in a fairly new field, he was still a child. His intelligence or ability doesn't come into the equation with this. He was a young person displaying signs of depression under a significant amount of stress, who chose to take matters into his own hands to relieve that stress. It's clear that his failed attempts brought a lot of shame on him, and he chose to run away from the world and use substances to escape. And I can completely understand that. My view is James likely just slipped through the net at the time. Perhaps his friends thought his mood was simply role-playing, but it's worth saying that those same friends would also have been quite young themselves and might not recognise signs of somebody going through a hard time, so that's also understanding. But based on the information I found, reading up on this case, it seems that every responsible adult that should have been looking out for him missed the signs, and seemed to have just treated him like he was a fully grown adult who was capable of taking on the world. The university staff are one of the biggest issues in this. They failed to notice his disappearance for a period of nearly a week before reporting to his family, and then they allowed crazy stories about his interests being the cause to be published. I think it goes without saying, but James was lost and failed by a system. Moving on to the fun parts of D&D, let's talk about all the fun things that D&D has that were taken as evil. Let's go with the obvious one first, magic. It's a role-playing game, especially one based on a fantasy setting. Magic is something that you can be reasonably assumed that a player might invest into. Spells are generally utility abilities like shooting a fireball to fight, gaining the ability to breathe underwater, or fall slowly to the ground, which are all useful abilities in a setting where you could see players infiltrating a castle or travelling through goblin-filled caves to find treasure. And for the most part, I don't believe it's these simple spells that are really the issue. It's the inclusion of necromancy in the setting. Necromancy is obviously viewed as black magic, something seen as evil and unholy in the real world, and players who choose to play this style are going to choose to be a naughty little wizard, because it's so much more fun to play that character than anything else, in my honest opinion. There's no reason why you wouldn't play whatever you want. Roleplay is a chance to live out adventures that aren't accessible to the average person, and although it's only in your head, it's a person's chance to have some form of power or to express themselves in a way they couldn't in real life. Unfortunately, the inclusion of the occult in a game that was played by a second boy who took his own life resulted in the formation of Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, or BAD, B-A-D-D, which feels like one of those acronyms that they started with and figured out the name from it. BAD was led by a woman named Patricia Pulling, whose son ended his own life in 1982. Patricia saw her son's emotional turmoil and ultimate actions as being cursed by D&D, and unsuccessfully attempted to sue the publishers. We'll return to BAD later, but for now remember them because they were moderately successful as a group through the Satanic Panic. What do you imagine when you think of a paladin? A strong noble knight possibly riding a horse, his armour shining in the sun? That's pretty much what they are in the D&D setting. However, they tend to dedicate themselves to a god, and therein lies the problem. They dedicate themselves to a god. The church were very quick to take sides on D&D, and when they found out that both magic, a facet of witchcraft, and so-called false idols were contained within the pages of a book that was readily available to everyone in a gaming and certain bookshops, as well as through postal orders, all hell broke loose. On a side note with the postal orders, One of my best memories from when I started out in wargaming was sending off a slip of paper from a paint set and receiving a copy of a White Dwarf magazine and a zombie and a goblin miniature for Warhammer Fantasy Battles. I've still got all three somewhere. The church went on into full panic mode and decided to take the fight to Dungeons and Dragons, or what I call, and more realistically, took the fight to P&P, preachers and parents. Tell honest God-fearing adults that their children were being introduced to texts that glorified other deities, and that the twist being that these deities are actual demons sent by Satan to claim their soul. Even looking at a copy of the Adventurer's Handbook would result in eternal damnation in a lake of fire. This was convenient for televangelists because saving your soul costs dollars, and only they can save you. After all, Jesus knows them, and he knows they're right. The ranks of the apparently righteous pastors armed themselves with false claims and cherry-picked out of context Bible quotes and began sharing their message with families, government bodies, medical professionals and educators in their effort to stop the wave of evil that was sweeping into the nation by bringing paying customers back into the church. During this time, a vast number of stories were shared through the television and VHS. I found a lot of them here on YouTube, and they're interesting to say the least. But one thing I can't deny is that despite most of the information being hogwash, the speakers do actually seem sincere. Maybe it's a testament to the profit that they could gain, or maybe they were honestly fearful of this. In this period, what is possibly the most infamous chick track, those little comic books that you get handed out by well-meaning church members, was released. This chick tract was called Dark Dungeon, and I personally can't do the thing justice because it's so ridiculous. But there is a movie here on YouTube that you can watch based on it. It's completely off the wall, but it's fun to watch if you're in the mood for a dark comedy or drunk. I don't condone getting drunk, but you never know. What if I told you teenage boys like to look at half-nude and nude women? Would that shock you? Well, bad notice that a lot of D&D handbooks contained hand-drawn images of women in a fantasy setting, and this did shock them. I'm not going to defend the artwork of the armour that these women wear. I don't think it's very effective either, but I can't deny the image of a warrior woman wearing a loincloth and bra armour isn't a classic image that endures today. But Bad took these images as just being fully sexual. And whilst it's difficult to fully disagree because there is an element of sexualising the women for titillation's sake, the images aren't supposed to be the focus of the book. They're what players would call flavour, and they add a little extra detail to the world that you're reading about. It's worth pointing out that contemporary conservatives that hold many of the same beliefs as the people against D&D in the 80s get very uppity when modern character models aren't dressed the way that they were depicted in the D&D handbooks. They argue that woke culture destroyed the video games industry by providing characters that wear effective armour and have normally proportioned bodies. The argument that Bad and their collaborators gave was that D&D promoted pornography, and this would lead to real-life deviance. This claim is unsubstantiated, however, but I can't disprove it. What I'm going to say is on the matter is if teenage boys want to see boobs, they're going to find a way. And that's all there is to D&D. There's probably a lot more on the religious aspects, since D&D does include a lot of demons as enemies and potentially player characters. But I'll finish up this section by giving one of Patricia Pullen's statistics. Patricia stated that there were as many as 500 instances per year of people ending their own life due to role-playing games. At the time of that statement, there were 7 in total. Fantastic 1982 single, The Number of the Beast, from the album of the same name. If you want my opinion on the album, I think The Number of the Beast should have been the opening track because of that eerie intro and it hits so hard, and is really effective after the opening narration. But I guess Invaders with this deliciously chunky bass line will have to do for us. Although it's not a mistake Maiden would make again, because they nailed every opening on every album since then, especially with 1984's Aces High on the album Power Slave. Seriously, if you've never heard these albums, they're classics and worth your time. Considering we just looked at how the church barged into the conversation about the corrupting effects of media, I think it becomes obvious why they would take offence at tracks like Number of the Beast with its Revelation-themed lyrics. But it wasn't only Maiden who received the brunt of this. In fact, they got off pretty easy given the circumstances, and I strongly believe that has something to do with being a British band that were just hitting their stride. Don't get me wrong, they'd already released 2 albums, the self-titled Offering of 1980 and 1981's Killers with Paul Di'Anno on vocals. Rest in peace, Paul. But Bruce Dickinson's inclusion on the album had really changed their sound, and they hit the big time with Number of the Beast. I'm going to add here that at the time of this recording, Nico McBrain, the drummer, has recently retired, and I want to thank him for all the years of joy that their music gave me, and being the drummer at my very first live gig. Every member of that band is a legend. The intricacies of why I believe a long-standing British metal band hit it big aside, there was once again an event that would cause the media to conflate a minor detail in a case. In fact, a detail that was so obscure that a rational person wouldn't have been able to pick it up, but these were irrational times, and the event was equally irrational. On December 23rd, 1985, a then 20-year-old James Vance and his 18-year-old friend Raymond Belknap had a session of heavy drinking and cannabis use, and they visited a church playground in Sparks, Nevada. Their plan was to enact a pact that would see them both dead by the next morning. However, plans rarely survive first contact with the enemy. The boys took with them a 12-gauge shotgun, which would generally be considered a weapon that could finish the job with ease. And for Belknap, it did. Reports state that he died instantly from his injuries. But for Vance, things were very different, and it comes down to a personal opinion if you think that he was lucky or not. Vance placed the weapon under his chin and pulled the trigger, and by some quirk of fate, only succeeded in blowing his jaw off and disfiguring his face. When he was found, he received medical help and something of facial reconstruction, but the results do speak for themselves on how successful this was. So what does this have to do with music causing Satan to infiltrate our lives? It's very simple, really. They were apparently listening to Judas Priest's 1987 album, Stained Class. The album includes a cover of Spooky Tooth's 1969 song, Better By You, Better Than Me, which is claimed to have been recorded after the rest of the album had been recorded. In 1990, the families of both boys attempted to sue Judas Priest, claiming that they had implanted subliminal messages into the song, alleging that phrases like "try suicide," "do it," and "let's be dead" were hidden in the track, and these subliminal messages had commanded the boys to carry out their acts. As evidence of the corrupting nature of the song, the band, and the genre in general, Vance's parents alleged that following the incident, James had been troubled for a long time, but had reaffirmed his faith in Christ, and by re-embracing his faith, he had changed for the better. A trial took place between July 16th and August 24th, 1990, where the track was played at different speeds and backwards, claiming the use of backmasking, which is a technique where a sound or phrase is intentionally recorded backwards, which is then famously alleged to have been used on the Beatles' Revolution 9, which claims the line "Paul is dead" is hidden in the track, which opened up a conspiracy theory of itself. The judge ultimately dismissed the case, commenting that the supposed message was a coincidental convergence of guitar chords with an exhalation pattern. And to close the situation, I'm going to let you in on a little key detail that perhaps swayed the judge a little. Despite James's supposed change for the better and reaffirmation as a child of God, James had died 2 years earlier. The cause of his death, it was a drug overdose. Whether intentional or by accident, maybe he wasn't as reformed as they thought. Another case that added to the scare was the case of Ricky Queso. I'm not going to try to defend this case in any form. For James Vance and Raymond Belknap, I can understand their position, and in a way it was societal expectations and their own struggles with mental health that obviously played a huge part in their actions. I don't condone what they did, because there's always another way or another person you can turn to, and I understand the desperation to make everything go away. But Ricky Queso was a different beast altogether. Queso was born on March 29th, 1967 to a high school history teacher and football coach in New York. Both his parents worked at Cold Spring Harbor High School, a very highly rated school which is unsurprisingly in the Cold Harbor area of New York, and as such they had high expectations of their child. It's alleged that as a teenager his behaviour often saw him thrown out into the streets, where he often found himself sleeping rough in either the local woods or in the cars and garages of his friends. During this time he developed a taste for various psychedelic substances, mainly cannabis and its derivatives, but he was also into LSD, PCP and something he referred to as purple microdots, which he believed was mescaline, but was more likely cheaply produced than incorrectly advertised LSD. And since the effects of the drugs are similar enough, he probably never thought about it. During this time he often acted as a dealer in the Northport area to sustain himself and his habits. However, it is stated that he often got high on his own supply, as the cool kids would say. Queso had a group of friends who called themselves the Knights of the Black Circle. These friends were nothing more than low-level drug dealers, selling cannabis products, and today we would see them as very inconsequential, especially in a climate where cannabis is being decriminalised in a lot of the US. In fact, it's probably unlikely that they would be able to operate in that capacity because of it, but at that time society saw any drug use as evil and satanic alongside other facets like musical choice, as they often go hand in hand. Despite their business dealings, they were friends, and I would have to think that they were very good friends based on what's to come, because they kept secrets that many wouldn't have, even if it was only to save their own skin. The Knights of the Black Circle had some dealings with the occult and often performed ceremonies in the woods and celebrated Walpurgis Night. Let me know if you would like me to cover this in another video. They covered Walpurgis Night in 112 Ocean Avenue, Amityville, and had previously been arrested for digging up and defacing colonial era graves, which I'm surprised didn't see them in prison, since defacing graves is a serious crime. As we've already seen, Queso and his friends were involved in various psychedelics, and that does come with certain risks. Whilst at a party, Queso passed out, holding 10 bags of PCP, and a friend by the name of Gary Lowers saw an opportunity to either make some cash or get a decent stash for himself, stealing it from Queso's jacket pocket. And although it's unknown how Queso found out that it was Lowers that had taken the bags, he did, and he approached him. But he was only able to retrieve half of the stash, and a promise of $50 in payment for the remaining half. And as a result of this, Queso began beating Lowers regularly. Although it's been misreported the following events happened on June 16th, it actually happened on June 19th, 1984. So looking at this case might yield different information for yourselves. So on the night of June 19th, Queso borrowed a radio from a friend and invited Lowers to get high in the woods. They were joined by Jimmy Trolano and Albert Quinones, and as they entered the woods, the group started consuming the drugs that they had, mixing them with PCP with the aforementioned purple microdots. They eventually found a place to settle and attempted to start a fire. Whether because of the mind-altering substances or their history, the situation worsened and Queso began assaulting Lowers, which escalated to him eventually biting him on the neck before producing a knife and stabbing him whilst demanding that Lowers say, "I love Satan." This attack was brutal, and it's alleged that Queso may have cut Lowers' eyes out in the melee whilst he was still alive. Lowers was stabbed somewhere between 17 and 36 times, reports do vary, defiantly saying that he loved his mother before relenting. After his death, Queso and Trolano covered the body in the scrub and left him. Lowers' last words were, "I love Satan." In the following 2 weeks, Queso bragged about the attack to as many people that he could find that would listen, and those that didn't believe him were invited to see the body. I'm unsure if the other boys were involved with these showcases of the grisly work, but most sources indicate that it was Ricky alone that was bringing people along. At some point during that 2-week period, Queso and Trolano came back, dug a shallow grave, and buried the now decomposing body, which must have been a grueling task considering the conditions. A search of the local weather conditions showed that despite a storm and record rainfall earlier in the month, the average temperatures were 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees Celsius, and was fairly humid, perfect conditions to speed up the breakdown of a body and the proliferation of insects. And despite how interesting this process is, I'm not going to go into detail about it unless you ask and subscribe. So the body would have been gooey. It's known that the body was buried in this period because on the 1st of July, an anonymous report was made to the police regarding the body. On the 4th of July, a search of the woods was conducted with cadaver dogs, that are dogs specially trained to smell corpses and are able to differentiate between animal and human carcasses. And to be honest, I don't know why there was a 3-day delay. I find it unlikely that a murder wouldn't be a big deal in such an affluent area. And unless things were very different back then, cadaver dogs are considered to be the same as a regular police officer and employed by all forces. Let's be honest, dogs are better than real police officers. When the body was discovered the same day, the investigation was thrown into overdrive and evidence was collected. The next day, that is the 5th of July, Queso and Trajano were tracked down and arrested. And again, I know what you're thinking, what's all this got to do with the Satanic Panic? You've spoken at length about acts of violence between teenagers and it doesn't add up. I'm glad you asked. When Queso was arrested, he was photographed wearing an AC/DC shirt. Yes, AC/DC have shook me all night long, Back in Black and Thunderstruck fame. A band that have always been a fairly fun band in terms of their front-facing persona in my opinion. This photograph is widely distributed, and just like with Vance and Belknap, discussed previously, the media frenzied like sharks around a particularly vulnerable tuna. It was a bloodbath, and the second they heard about the Knights of the Black Circle, the rumours of satanic influences multiplied sevenfold, and there was another part of this case that would ultimately solidify these claims. During the investigation, it was claimed by Queso and a number of those he had bragged to about the murder that Satan had presented himself to Queso in the form of a crow, the most spooky of all birds, and guided him to murder, claiming that he would gain his favour and demonic power if he followed through. In fact, Queso not only made this claim, he claimed that prior to the attack, he had asked if he should kill Lowers and the crow had cawed as if in response, which he took as a sign in the affirmation. This detail gave the final piece of the puzzle, confirming that satanic forces were real and they were infiltrating the fancier parts of society, including those with fine and upstanding parents. These actions and claims were proof that music could infect the minds of the youth and cause them to turn away from our Lord and Saviour and walk a path on a highway to hell. Even though this monster doesn't deserve any more of our time, I suppose I have to finish Queso's story. And whilst you might see the ending as a good ending, I assure you it's not. 2 days after his arrest, on July 7th, Queso took steps to remove himself from the situation in the most cowardly way possible, and he was found hanging in his cell. Yes, it seems like a win on the surface. He was arrested and died following, so he could never hurt anyone again, right? Unfortunately, no. His death let him dodge justice, which would be a prison cell where he would stare at the wall until he grew old and frail, and to make it worse, his death acted as another instance of Beelzebub twisting the mind and just further stoked the flames of his infamy. Should Queso be forgotten? No, not really, and I'll explain why I think so in a moment. But he shouldn't have become something of a poster boy for any and all of the bad things. So why do I think he shouldn't be forgotten? There's 2 reasons, but they can be answered in the same way. Queso was a mentally ill young man who was failed by multiple support systems, including his own parents. And this might seem like an unfair comment, but think about it. When he was in hospital with pneumonia, they wanted him admitted to a mental asylum, which seems altruistic, but what about before that? What about the times when he was thrown out onto the streets because of his poor behaviour? The behaviour that could have been chalked up to what could possibly have been a very manageable mental health condition. And had it been dealt with effectively instead of exiling him, shown that they had very little interest in his well-being, he probably would never have gotten mixed up with substance abuse, and this is a clear failing on their behalf in my eyes. They did too little, too late, and at the time, it would be impossible to address this issue. Now that we've seen the worst of what rock music was doing, and it was bad, I won't deny that, but these cases are something that we saw right through the D&D section as well. Poor mental health identification and care. Vance and Belknap were clearly depressed, and they weren't just sad, they were clinically depressed, likely finding solace in their shared friendship and the music they enjoyed together, whilst Queso was potentially schizophrenic or suffering from a similar dissociative disorder, and his self-medication with illicit substances which could have shown some potential chemical uses in controlled doses and regimens didn't help in the slightest. It's undeniable the 80s were possibly the greatest period in history for toy ranges and their accompanying cartoons. You've got Transformers, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, K-Base and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles hitting the scene and becoming worldwide phenomena overnight. The business model behind these toys was frankly amazing from a capitalism perspective. You create a toy line and then you draw kids in by advertising to them on a daily basis through a half-hour long cartoon. Get them hooked on the cartoon and the sales will take care of themselves. Unlike D&D and music, the connection to the Satanic panic doesn't come as surface level details that got blown out of proportion and are more ingrained in the cartoons themselves. So through research I haven't found a single event that caused an uproar. However, I did find information about a book and TV show called Turmoil in the Toy Box, which I'm going to cover separately. Let's have a look at what scared people during that period. I will admit there's a lot of what could be perceived as occultic imagery in the cartoons. He-Man in particular was based around the battle for Eternia, a planet at the centre of the universe where Prince Adam, a frail boy, would fight Skeletor, a muscle-bound skeleton, which doesn't make much sense when you think about it, using magic and by shouting something I got no doubt most people are watching has said, "By the power of Grayskull, I have the power." And that would transform him into He-Man, a powerful man with a sword right in a top battle cap, which would allow him to effectively deal with any nefarious deeds Skeletor was up to on that day. He-Man did dabble a lot in magical plotlines, and the inclusion of the 4-girls version She-Ra had even more of a witchcraft focus, with the main characters being specifically magic users in their fight against evil. There was also K-Base, which is something I remember being into myself as a child, but I really can't remember what the whole show was about as an adult. I'm guessing it's the whole power of friendship deal, but their ability to use lasers from their belly buttons is seen as occultic. I'm not sure why though, because nobody's ever tried to disprove that bears don't naturally have laser belly buttons yet, so I'm gonna guess we'll have to assume they do. Take note though, K-Bear is a show about cuddly teddy bears who originated on greeting cards, solving problems by being kind or being labelled as evil. There truly was nothing that the right wing weren't willing to turn into a monster to feed their narrative. This one is very self-explanatory. Throughout a lot of the shows, the idea of meditation is used. This will either help a character come to some sort of realization about themselves, which is a very healthy practice of self-improvement, or as part of their training. These different types of meditative practice were often linked with yoga, seen as a new age belief system. It's not really though, from my experience it's more like a relaxation fitness technique, but maybe someone knows more about it than, and they can correct me in the comments. But these practices are linked with non-Christian gods. If children are practicing these things, then they're effectively praying to heathen gods and demons. As a parent myself, I can relate to this one in a way. Many of these shows do have a strong focus on martial arts and can break down a plot about turning a device that will block the sun into a brawl where the villain gets beaten to the brink of death, but escapes by the skin of their teeth before being captured. Do I think that solves problems? No, you can't solve an ideological disagreement by punching it, but the plot of these stories often comes down to good versus evil. The bad guys are often after world domination or just mass killing, and the only way the hero's going to stop them is to beat them with a little slap. Like New Age beliefs, martial arts are usually linked to meditation and Eastern traditions. In this case, it's all about finding that balance inside themselves to be able to control their actions, and isn't a form of prayer. But this connection exists, and contact was never the opposition's strong suit. To conclude the section, I'm going to mention that all of these shows are often high fantasy or hard science fiction in some cases. And based on this, the issues mentioned are actually part of the plot and setting. I personally can't imagine Lord of the Rings without the Rings of Power, items that would be considered as talisman, or Ghostbusters without the ghosts. In fact, I'd go as far as saying that these franchises just don't exist without those aspects. But within their story, they make sense. They're the main conflicts of the story. The writers of the cartoons never looked at this from a chance to convert children to Christianity. They simply followed the rule of cool. It looked exciting and interesting, so they included it, and it's as simple as that. that's taken us for the 80s, and whilst the 90s are very similar, I've covered them in less depth, which bring us through to the modern day, or what I would consider the modern day, and explain why we're living through which right now. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with me. I do really appreciate it, and it's my great honor to choose to stick with me through this video. This video is literally a week of research. I think it's through and it's difficult to find out and breaking the news out there. These people are literally doing it. It's one of them. It's a really super third country. It's in the right place. It's always really good about from those stuff. Yeah, that's what that is. The creation of the other brilliant. Whilst recording this video, you might have noticed that my clothes changed quite a lot. And the reason being, there were times when you couldn't hear the sound. When I started recording this time, the weather suddenly turned into a deluge of rain. I need to point out that Chip has now left, unfortunately. Fortunately, I did the job, I got him well again, and he left. He's occasionally come back and stolen some food, but he's big now. The garden's growing well. And if we run really quickly through, this is our current state. This is corn. We got some carrots down there, Carolina Reaper chilies, pumpkins, but they keep getting eaten by something once the pumpkins grow. We got some peas and beans that are not doing so well. You can see it down there, a cucumber, rhubarb, more chilies. Yeah, that's the garden now. I'm going to go indoors now because, you know, it's not very nice out here. And I will speak to you next time.